was awesome. So my dad just got back from Nigeria, and he was just ranting and raving about what an amazing experience it was, and so now I understand why. That was special. Well, it is good to be with you all here. I intend to speak as slowly as possible because I know Jimmy won't be able to keep up if I speak quickly. And we probably have some Aggies in the room too, so I'll keep that in mind. Well, it's good to be with you all. I cut my teeth in inner city community development work with Mission Waco, and as many of you know, anytime that you relocate into an urban poor neighborhood, you probably have all kinds of stories to tell. Shortly after we moved into a house on 15th Street, just a few blocks down from Mission Waco, this was almost 20 years ago, my soon-to-be wife, Amy, and I had just gotten back from a camping trip. It wasn't uncommon for us to have homeless living with us, or we had prostitutes that worked out of the front yard because Jimmy had pushed them all down to our lot, and we had a halfway house for people getting out of prison on drug-related crimes, and so they were across the street from us, and so we just had an eclectic bunch at our home all the time, and we even slummed it with some seminary professors periodically too. But one particular evening, my wife and I had just gotten back from a camping trip, and so she had taken a bunch of incriminating pictures of me and had them, that was back in the old day when you actually had pictures back from a trip, and so she had pictures, and she walked out into our living room while I was still back in my bedroom, and she walked out and she saw a man in the living room, and she said, "Hey, you want to see some funny pictures of Slim?" That was my nickname back then. I wish it could still be my nickname. But she said, "You want to see some funny pictures of Slim?" And so he gets up and he walks over to her and he says, "Well, sure." And so they start looking at these really funny pictures of me. And I walk out of the bedroom and he just immediately starts clowning on me. He's just making fun of me. He's saying how goofy I was. And of course he was right. So we laughed and we talked to him for a little bit. And then we decided, okay, well, I need to take her home. So we said goodbye. We walked out the back door. Little did we know that this man had broken into our house, and he was trying to steal our TV and our VCR when my wife came in there, or my fiance at the time. So we walk outside. I'm telling her goodbye. I'm getting her loaded up in her car, and sure enough, he walks around the house and comes back down the street. It's dark at night, so we didn't realize that he was carrying our VCR with him, and we waved goodbye. "Hey, man, it was great talking to you." And we were the goofy new family next door, I guess. Well, I did just have an opportunity for the last 2 years to serve in this congressional commission called the National Commission on Hunger. It was a very special experience. I felt very privileged to be able to serve in that particular capacity. But like most Washington-based committees, it was contentious from the beginning. We had 5 Democrats that had been appointed and 5 Republicans that had been appointed, and everything that a Democrat or Republican would say, the other party would disagree. And so our task by Congress was to develop recommendations back to Congress and back to the President and back to USDA on what we should do to address hunger and poverty in the United States. And they joke, it felt like a joke. They said, do what you can, but don't spend any more money. And so I felt like we were trying to run a race with one leg tied behind our back. But we got in there, and everything that we said, we argued for many meetings over many days there in D.C. But finally, we decided that we were going to commit to consensus, that we were going to make consensus recommendations back to Congress, even though we didn't know how we were going to possibly do that because we are all on such different pages. What we ultimately ended up doing was we got out of Washington. We started traveling around the country and seeing food insecurity, the harshest forms of food insecurity or hunger all over the country. And we saw it together. And by traveling together and getting to know each other, we slowly began to cultivate trust. And as we began to cultivate trust, that trust led to collaboration, and ultimately we were able to make 20 consensus recommendations back to Congress, the President, and to USDA. But along those ways, we saw and heard stories of poverty and food insecurity, some of which we expected and some of which were beyond anything we'd ever seen before. And most of these folks have spent their entire lives working on these issues. In one community in the Anacostia neighborhood of D.C., historically one of the most violent communities in the country, We sat down with community members, and they were excited that the minimum wage rate had been raised in their community, but it hadn't kept up with the cost of rent. It was costing them $2,000 to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in the lowest income area of D.C. And they said, how are we going to make it? How are we going to make it? We traveled to the Acoma Pueblo, just outside of Albuquerque in New Mexico. We sat with Native American members, both of the Acoma tribe and some neighboring tribal communities, and they told us the history of their people and the community, and they took us to their holy sites so that we could have a better understanding of who they were as a people and what that land meant to them as a people. But they were a people without opportunity. They were too far away from any of the jobs that Albuquerque could offer. There wasn't a big oil boom in New Mexico, so they didn't have places that they could go and work. And so they were sitting there together in their poverty, trying to help each other make it through each day. We ended up going from there to the Texas-Mexico border to visit the colonias. Many of us have spent time in the colonias here in Texas. It's not a new phenomenon for us, but for our friends and our counterparts who were from New York and Boston and Chicago, it was the harshest form of poverty they'd ever seen in the United States. As you know, in the colonias, oftentimes what happens is people don't have running water. They don't have electricity. They put their homes together. They build them with whatever they can find, maybe spare tires. Maybe they use homemade bricks. Maybe they use tin or plywood to construct their homes. The situations are pretty dire. We heard from 200 different people that gave testimony to us over the course of our trips across the country. And one of them was an Aggie. He was an Aggie professor, and his job was to work to improve the conditions of families living in the colonias. He worked with what he calls promotoras, or social workers oftentimes in the communities, and public health advocates. And he said that they would go door to door in the colonias along the Texas-Mexico border. When they would go door to door, they would ask them, if they were able to find work, if transportation was a barrier. In many of those communities, they didn't have roads, and so what could they do to begin to construct roads into their communities? But one of the things they would also ask is they would ask to look in the refrigerator of each of the households if they had one. And one particular social worker asked a family if they could look in the refrigerator, and they granted her permission. She went and she opened the fridge, and all that was in there were a bag of chicken bones. The social worker turned to the family and said, "Why in the world are there chicken bones in your refrigerator?" And she said, "This way, when my children open up the refrigerator, they'll at least see that something's there." I'm reminded of FDR's famous quote, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide for those who have too little." Right now in the United States, we have 48 million Americans that are considered food insecure. I know many of you are working up the stream from food insecurity. You're trying to create jobs and opportunity in your neighborhoods. You're trying to transform your city. Thank goodness for that, because most people experience food insecurity because of poverty. 1 in 5 children in the United States is food insecure. 1 in 4 in the state of Texas. Down in the Texas-Mexico border, it's 1 in 2 children experiences hunger on a regular basis. And we certainly know that number is going to spike again as we see more and more children immigrating to avoid violence in Central America. Well, we can do better than that. The prophet Isaiah warned us to share our food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter. When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from our own flesh and blood. But it's important that we as people of faith work for justice. But it's equally important about how we work for justice. I know I've got 2 boys that are on the cusp of puberty in our house. We have 3 boys total. One's in diapers. My wife and I slept through high school biology and didn't quite figure out how it all worked. But we've got these 2 older boys, and they're on the cusp of puberty, and so it's just wild in our house all the time. And I know that when I was of that similar age, when I was playing high school basketball, my coach would always joke with me and say that the half-court line would jump up and trip me every time I ran by. I was a clumsy kid, and sometimes our work for justice is also clumsy. Shortly after I'd taken a job with Mission Waco, I was invited to speak at a conservative Christian school there in Waco. And Jimmy already knows where I'm going. And so it was shortly after 9/11. They had invited me because the school was interested in volunteering with Mission Waco. And so they wanted to know how they could engage in our neighborhood. But in my 24-year-old wisdom, I thought that they needed to hear a Christian pacifist response to 9/11 and what they should do to support love rather than dropping bombs. So I went there and I dropped a bomb on that community. They were not ready for that. By the time I got back to the office, the principal had already called Jimmy and chewed him out and said, we just wanted to know how we could volunteer. We didn't want a theological disposition on pacifism. Jimmy said, Jeremy, he said, man, he said, you just needed to take them from A to B, and you tried to take them from A to Z. I was clumsy. I didn't know. I was trying to learn and figure out my way. We can remember those Baptists in Haiti. They went down there after the earthquake, and they wanted to make sure, that families were safe, like a lot of missionaries did. And they went down, and with the best intentions in mind, they rounded up a group of children, and they were going to help those children to safety, and so they were going to smuggle them to the Dominican. What they didn't know, even though the families wanted them to do that, what they didn't know is that was oftentimes a pathway for kids to end up in the human trafficking system. Well, they were arrested, they were thrown in jail, became an international incident. They had good intentions, but they clumsily were trying to make justice happen. More recently, here in the state of Texas, you've all heard that our governor is opposed to taking in Syrian refugees. That's not something that we as people of faith would agree with him on. One of our organizations that we work with closely decided that they were going to take it upon themselves to vehemently disagree with the governor. So they wrote letters to the governor, they wrote letters to our state commissioners. They were very vocal about the work that we needed to do to address the Syrian refugee issue. They didn't take into context necessarily who they were working with, and they didn't figure out ways that they could take their justice and make it a reality, but they wanted to say, this is where we stand. Unfortunately, we'd spent over the past several years building a community partner program that created 1,400 community-based organizations that were offering resources that the government previously used to offer. And as a result, we were redistributing more money into poor households in our state of Texas than we'd ever done before. But when the governor heard about this, he was upset. And so he wanted to kill the program as well as the organization that opposed him. All of us were acting out of a sense of righteousness. All of us were desiring justice, but uniformly our advocacy only made situations worse for the people we claim to fight for. I believe if we want to bring lasting social change, it can only come by cultivating trust and working collaboratively in our communities. That brings reconciliation and ultimately healing. After working with Mission Waco, my wife and I moved to the west side of San Antonio, and she told me when we got there, it's historically one of the poorest areas in Texas. There are about 150,000 residents that live in that community. The median income at the time when we moved there was less than $19,000 per household, and typically you had 3 to 4 generations sharing a home. She told me when we got there, she said, in reference to a Henry Blackaby quote, she said, listen, it's not, God's been here long before we got here, and God will continue to be here long after we leave. All you have to do is identify where is God moving and work collaboratively with God. That's all that you have to do. Well, we had that in mind when we created the Texas Hunger Initiative almost 8 years ago. What we found is that there were over 4,000 organizations doing great work across the state of Texas to address the issue of hunger, but we still had 5.5 million food insecure people. We knew we could do better. We knew because we visited these organizations, we found out that they were overwhelmed with the need in front of them on a day-to-day basis. And since they were overwhelmed, they didn't have the opportunity or the luxury to look up and see what other organizations were doing in their community. But we knew that if we worked together, we were more likely to address the issue of hunger systemically. In our work in San Antonio, we ultimately ended up creating a social enterprise, a little business in the community. We were able to create 15 jobs. We were able to leverage several other businesses that ultimately created about 100 jobs in our neighborhood. But what we learned is that when you create 100 jobs in a neighborhood of 150,000 low-income residents, that's just a drop in the bucket. And with my experience in Waco and San Antonio and Washington, D.C. and Birmingham beforehand, one of the things we realize is that people are largely experiencing food insecurity and poverty for the same reasons across the country. And so we try to address the issue purely as a local issue. It's like trying to address internal bleeding with a topical cream. It doesn't matter how much cream you put on your body, you're not going to stop the bleeding. You have to work at a local, state, and federal level simultaneously if you're going to deal with systemic issues like hunger and poverty. That's why organizations like the CCDA network are of critical importance. You can contextualize your approach in your local community, but you can be working collaboratively with people from across the state and around the country. We needed to do the same thing for hunger. What we began to do is create what we call now hunger-free community coalitions. First thing that we did is we met with state government. Our 3 commissioners who were working administering hunger programs had never met each other. So we got them around a table with the federal government in Waco, literally a round table in the Chamber of Commerce building. We said we have 5.5 million food insecure people, and it's our fault. So what are we going to do about it? Fortunately, everybody at the table agreed, and they were willing to roll up their sleeves and work together to figure out what to do. We jokingly call that group the Justice League of Hunger. Those commissioners aren't there anymore, and we're hoping that their new commissioner replacements will live into the legacy that they brought before. But they began to collaborate on the state level. We did the same thing on a national level, but on the local community level, that's where the rubber hits the road, and we wanted to see what would happen. So we identified 6 pilot communities. San Angelo, Texas was not one of them. And after we'd identified these 6 pilot communities and began to go to the communities organizing, we got a phone call from 2 women in San Angelo, Texas, 2 Baptist women, Mary and Carol. They called and they said, hey, we just had a plant close in our community. We have a lot of kids that are experiencing food insecurity and their families are not doing well. We need to be a pilot community for THI. And I told them, you know, I'm sorry, but we've already got our pilot communities. And these 2 stubborn women would not get off the phone. And so I said, I really am sorry, but maybe call me back next year. Maybe we can add another pilot community next year or maybe the year after that. But these women would not take no for an answer. And so finally, I came up with an ad hoc community assessment, an assessment that we now take communities through. We're taking the state of Oklahoma through it right now. It typically takes us about a year to take a community through it. These women finished it in 3 weeks, and they called me and they said, now can we be a pilot community? What can you say? I said, well, I think you already are. So I went out to San Angelo. They had the congressman there in his office. They had the mayor, the city council, the superintendents, and principals of the schools. They had the nonprofit leaders and the faith community there. They had the businesses there. They were all ready to go. As a part of the assessment, they realized they had 8,500 children on the free and reduced lunch program in their community. But they'd only served 1,000 meals to kids over the course of the entire summer of 2009. They already knew what they wanted to do. Churches stood up and they said, hey, we've got commercial kitchens, we'll make the meals. Churches and nonprofits in low-income neighborhoods said, hey, we'll be summer meal sites and we can serve the meals. And businesses and educational leaders said, well, you know, if we do physical activity with the children and we keep their minds active, then they're going to be less likely to forget what they learned the previous school year. So we're going to volunteer and help you do that. In just a couple months worth of planning, that community served 20,000 meals to children in their community. Since then, they've served well over 120 or 130,000 meals to kids in the summer. But it didn't stop there. It continued forth. Then they realized kids are living in food deserts, and so they needed to address food deserts. And so Jimmy is creating a grocery store in a food desert that we have in our neighborhood right now. Huge for families. And so they created community gardens in low-income neighborhoods. And then they wanted to make sure that families had access to public benefits if they needed access to public benefits. So they began to register families. Conservative Republicans began to register families for the SNAP program in their community because they saw poverty and they wanted to help people move out of poverty. I've been working with Speaker Ryan's office on a plan. He's been bit by the poverty bug. And because of his faith perspective, he wants to do something about it. So I was with his office 2 weeks ago, and we joked, and I said, you know, I'm glad that your heart is in the right place. Maybe in a year or two, we'll get your head in the right place too. And I don't think they thought that was as funny as I did, but I still think it was good. That's right. It was clumsy justice work. That's right. But they had seen, because of some work that Catholic Charities has done, a model called contextualized case management. Basically what they're doing, if any of you have seen the Fidelity commercials and you see the blue line that kind of runs down the sidewalk, and it's the idea of how you can retire well or something. Basically they're taking that idea and they're applying it to low-income families. Fort Worth Catholic Charities is really piloting this project, and they have identified a plan and have begun working already, and very successfully, to take a contextualized approach and meet with families and provide comprehensive case management, to be able to work with them to help them figure out how to get from where they are today to financial independence. And when they say financial independence, they mean livable wage paying jobs and 3 months of their livable wage paying salary in a savings account. Not utilizing government resources. And so they recognize that government resources and that local private resources are a key to getting people to that point. What we've learned, and one of the reasons that organizations like yours are critical in programs like the Community Partner Program, are because you do your job because of your sense of mission and purpose. You are there not because you care about helping somebody fill out an application. You're there because you care about that person holistically, because Christ has called you to love your neighbor as yourself. So the kind of care and respect that you're going to treat individuals as they come in to meet with you is very different than they're going to get when they go to a state agency office. Your job isn't to just push paper and get them out of the way to deal with the next client. You're there to see that they are created in the image of God just like you are. And for whatever reason today, you're not on the other side of that desk. And you want to treat them with the same respect that you would want people to treat your children with. And you're going to invest in them. And when you do that, you develop stronger social networks for these individuals. The faculty that worked with us have identified that when individuals, even if they live below the poverty line, have a strong social network, they're less likely to be food insecure. And they're more likely to be put on a path towards self-sustainability. Well, we've taken these models and we've replicated them. One of the things since when I took the job at THI, being that it's a project at Baylor, Dean Diana Garland, who passed away this past year, sat me down and she said, now Jeremy, this is not a social service agency, this is a university. So everything that you do, we have to be able to develop models that we can replicate to other poverty issues, and we have to be able to replicate it in other states. And you have to research everything that you do if you're going to implement anything. Well, I wasn't exactly a kid that did real well in school, and so I knew that we needed to recruit people to kind of come alongside us. But we developed a model we now call informed engagement. And basically, it's like the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower, as you remember, goes out in the field and he's scattered seed every which direction. Some falls on good soil, some falls on bad soil, but only the seed that falls on good soil produces fruit. And we identified that when you use research to come alongside your community engagement strategies, you're more likely to find out where that good soil is. So all of your efforts, you're casting seed in a place that's going to produce fruit. Well, one of those areas for us was breakfast. We found out that when kids don't have breakfast before school, they have more discipline problems. Obviously, they're not going to perform well in school because they're not going to be able to concentrate. If you can't remember what it's like to not be able to concentrate when you miss a meal, then I would encourage you sometime this next week, just skip one meal. Skip lunch. Just skip lunch one time this next week. And just pay attention to what's going on in your body. If it's been a while for you, pay attention. Start to get headaches. It's hard to concentrate. You start to get twitchy. Last thing you're going to be able to do, especially if you're a child, is to be able to concentrate on your work. We found out that when you simply change the location of where kids get breakfast and you move it into the classroom, it reduces the stigma of being the poor child showing up before school eating breakfast in the cafeteria. And then it makes access for everybody. Everybody can have access to breakfast when you're serving it in the classroom in the first 10 minutes of the day. Simply by changing the location of where we serve breakfast to children, we've been able to see an increase to breakfast for 300,000 children in the state of Texas. 72 million more meals have been served to children at breakfast because of that program. So this research actually worked. In Dallas Independent School District, they serve nearly 100,000 children, 98,000 specifically, children 3 meals a day, 5 days a week during the school year, and they are one of the biggest contributors to summer meal access during the summer. But we also met a man named Jesus. So Jesus runs a nutrition program out in Anthony, West Texas. Believe it or not, Anthony exists west of El Paso, and it's still in Texas. So who knew, right? Well, there are a whole lot of people who live west of El Paso, right on the Texas, Mexico, and New Mexico border. Poverty is severe in that area. So they partnered with 12 of our business school faculty who helped them develop a business model to be able to serve meals to children during the summer and after the school year, because they knew they were going to lose money if they didn't have a good business model to be able to operate the program with. So Jesus went and hired about 50 high school kids. He put them in 2 shifts. A morning shift, and they would come into the high school cafeteria, and they would make meals all morning. And then the bus would pick them up, and they would get in pairs with a cooler, and the kids would just fill up the bus. And then they would be dropped off at summer meal sites across the community, not just in Anthony. No, Jesus made a point to serve all the kids in the whole region. And so they were driving all over that part of West Texas serving meals to kids. And after they would drop off a pair, and they'd drop off the next pair, and after everybody had been dropped off, it was time to pick everybody back up again. And by doing it that way, they were able to save money. But Jesus had built trust in the community. He knew that collaborating both with Baylor and community organizations was going to be the key to reducing food insecurity among the children that he cared so much about. He was a product. He was one of those children growing up. So then once the bus would get back to the school, they'd pick up the next shift, and they'd go do it all over again to make sure that kids were getting at least 2 meals a day during the summer months. Jesus serves 4,000 children a day in that part of Texas. I joked with my dad recently. I said, Jesus serves 5,000, but he only did it once. And Jesus is doing 4,000 meals a day. So you tell me. I don't know. Well, the results of that kind of work have been now we've served more than 21 million meals, additional meals to children during the summer months. We have more than 2,000 new summer meal sites in the state of Texas, many of which are in churches like this. Churches have an opportunity to fulfill their sense of mission and purpose and serve their community right outside their door. We have 1,400 community organizations that are providing resources through the Community Partner Program. And more kids having access to breakfast, and 12 million more meals have been served to kids after school. It's incredible. We've had some success, but we still have a long way to go. Our brothers and sisters of color are still not treated with respect and dignity. Our poor are still commonly blamed for their plight. Dr. King warned us that human progress is neither automatic or inevitable, that every step towards the goal of justice required sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, and that justice will only be the result of tireless exertions and passionate concerns of dedicated individuals. Last night on PBS, I'm a PBS documentary nut, there was a story of Willie Velasquez. Willie started Southwest voter registration. Every Latino politician can trace their roots back to Willie Velasquez. He signed up millions of Hispanic voters during the 70s and early 80s. Unfortunately, Willie died before he hit 50. Willie's daughter, Catarina, I got to know when I was in San Antonio. The little business we started was a coffee shop. We didn't know how to start a coffee shop, but the community said that's what they wanted to do. So we transformed a mission center into a coffee shop. Well, Catarina, who was an owner of the nicest coffee shop in town, which was really in close proximity to the one that we started, said, I'm going to help you open this shop. And so she came and she volunteered her time to train our staff, to help us figure out how to use a cash register, to make what became the neighborhood favorite, the Mocha Latina. Catarina loved our coffee shop because it was next door to the building where her dad so many years ago had started Southwest Voter, which was transformative for our West Side community and communities like that all across the southern United States. Well, Catarina was a giant. It was no surprise that she actually sold her stake in her coffee shop to come and run our coffee shop when I left to come work with THI. But the community knew that by building trust and by working together, they could see transformation. One evening about midnight, I got a phone call, and a gang had broken into our coffee shop. So I went down to the coffee shop, and I saw that the doors had been kicked in, the glass was all broken. We had put computers in our coffee shop because only 3% of the households had access to a computer at that time. They'd stolen all of our computers, the coffee shop, the tables were turned over and kicked in. I was mad. They had arrested a couple of the gang members already. Fortunately, some of the cops would drink coffee at our coffee shop, and so they had a whole task force and a helicopter looking everywhere for these computers. They knew these computers were important, and so within an hour, they had 6 of the 7 computers returned to our coffee shop. Well, I didn't know what to do. The cops said, okay, we got to go on and do our job elsewhere. But the doors were kicked in. I said, well, what do I do? And they said, well, that's not our problem. You're going to have to figure that out. And so about that time, members from the community, from the housing project next door to the coffee shop, which was the first housing project created in the United States, the Alizon Apache Courts. Members, knowing that the gang members' headquarters was there in that housing project, they came out to help anyway. So the kids came and they said, well, we'll help you set up the computers, because they knew I didn't know how to do that. And the men in the community said, well, we'll go get our tools and we'll get some wood and we'll be able to we'll be able to repair the doors and the windows to make sure that nobody gets in the rest of the night. By the next morning, we had the coffee shop completely repaired and ready to go and ready to be open for business. And a guy from a glass company around the corner was there replacing the windows. I was sitting around a table with my coworkers, and we were kind of talking about the events that had happened that night when the leader of the gang, the sergeant of the gang, walked in the doors. He looked around the room. He looked at the computers. He saw that everything was set up as it was the day before, and I could tell he was mad. Being the clumsy guy that I was, I asked him, do you need anything? He didn't respond. So I assumed he couldn't hear me, so I yelled it louder. Do you need anything? He still didn't respond. So I said, can I help you? He still didn't respond, and he turned around and he walked out. So I followed him into the street. I said, one more time, do you need anything? He turned around. He looked at me in the face with his hands clenched, his fist clenched. I don't know what happened. I don't know how God intervened, but in that moment, I didn't get knocked to the ground. But we were scared to death. We knew these gang members were showing us that they were serious about creating and instilling fear in that community. They'd been selling drugs right behind that coffee shop for a long time, and they didn't want any signs of hope happening in their area. So we gathered up our team, and many of them lived doors down from these gang members who lived and ruled that housing project. We decided it would be best for us all to get out of town for the weekend. I switched cars with a friend across town because I knew they knew my car, and the last thing I wanted was a drive-by at my house, and I just lived a couple of blocks away. After the weekend, we reconvened, and our staff who are from the neighborhood said, this is a symbol of hope. We've worked hard. We've collaborated to build this. We're not going to let these gang members take it from us. And they said, and think about all these community members that came out to help us fix the shop, not only when we built the shop initially, but just now after it had been broken into. So they decided, we're going to have a barbecue. We're going to have a barbecue, and we're going to do it right in front of where the gang sells drugs. And we're going to invite everybody in the neighborhood, and we're going to throw this barbecue. We're going to pay for it out of our own pocket. We're going to throw the barbecue for the people in the community to appreciate all that they've done to make this shop viable. And they did. They made a point. We're going to invite the gang members. So we did. Of course, most of the gang members didn't want to be a part of it. Ultimately, the city council made sure that they got that gang out of that housing project. But there were a couple men in that gang that saw something different. Because of trust that had been cultivated in that community and because of collaboration, it was social change that was beginning to last. Those moments were transformative. Those gang members became a part of our little coffee shop community and began drinking coffee and using those computers that they'd worked so hard to steal just a few months before that. When we come together and we work as a community, that's where transformation happens. That's when we participate with God in seeing the kingdom transform before our eyes. I mean, we all know that history is going to judge us based upon what we do or do not do to further the cause of justice. And I can assure you that for those of us in this room today who hold seats of power or privilege, which is pretty much all of us, we're here at a conference during the middle of the week. We are going to be judged based upon what we do to further the cause of justice by spending ourselves on behalf of the hungry and poor in our nation and around the world. We all know that. And I pray that we will have the courage of Dr. King and Willie Velasquez and Diana Garland, whose steps towards the goal of justice required struggling and sacrifice and suffering. And if we do, then may the prophet Isaiah's words be true in our life, that our light will rise in the darkness, that our night will become like the noonday, that we will be like well-watered gardens, like springs whose waters never fail. That our people will be the people who rebuild the ancient ruins and raise up the age-old foundations. That we will be called the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets with dwellings, the ones who actually made America great again. Thank you.